The smell of the New York City subway system at 3 in the morning is a specific chemical cocktail of ozone, stale urine, grinding metal, and a deep, earthy rot that has been fermenting in the dark for over a century. A scent that most people only get a whiff of while waiting for the A train, but one that I have breathed in for 12 hours a night, 6 nights a week, for the last 5 years as a Tier 3 sanitation and structural maintenance specialist. A fancy title that basically means I'm the guy they send down into the deepest, blackest arteries of the city to clear the blockages, fix the rusted tracks, and poison the things that live in the walls so the morning commuters don't have to look at them while they sip their lattes. But lately the job had changed. The atmosphere in the tunnels had shifted from the usual grim indifference to something heavy and expectant, a tension that hung in the stagnant air like the static charge before a lightning strike. And it started about a month ago when the noise stopped. The constant, background scuttling of claws on concrete that is the soundtrack of the underground just vanished, replaced by a silence that was unnatural and absolute. A silence that made the dripping of condensation from the overhead pipes sound like hammer blows against my skull. And I remember telling my supervisor, a gruff, burnt-out lifer named Sal who had spent 30 years breathing brake dust, that the rat population seemed to have crashed, that maybe the new bait we were using, a potent neurotoxin called Vector 9 that came in black canisters with no manufacturer labels, was actually working. But Sal just looked at me with eyes that were too wide, too pale, and told me to shut up and do my rounds, told me that the city didn't pay us to ask questions about the ecology of the tunnels. They paid us to keep the trains running, so I shut up. I zipped my heavy orange hazmat suit all the way to the chin, adjusted the strap of my headlamp, and descended into the maintenance shaft near the 14th Street station, the iron ladder vibrating against my palms with the phantom rumble of the city above. And as I hit the gravel floor of the tunnel, the beam of my light cutting a cone of white through the suffocating darkness, I felt that prickle on the back of my neck. The primitive biological alarm that tells you are being watched by something that does not wish you well. But I ignored it because I had a job to do. I had a quota of track miles to inspect. So I started walking, my heavy boots crunching on the oil-stained ballast, the third rail humming with its lethal electric song just inches from my leg. And the further I went into the labyrinth, past the abandoned stations that hadn't seen a passenger since the 1940s, past the ghost platforms where the tile was peeling like dead skin, the more I realized that the rats hadn't died off. They had changed because the usual chaotic mess of trash, the discarded coffee cups, the wet newspapers, the endless sea of plastic bags, was missing. The tracks were clean, disturbingly clean, as if a janitorial crew had come through with brooms and dustpans, sweeping the filth away. But sanitation crews never came this deep. Nobody came this deep except me and Sal and the things that lived here, and I stopped, kneeling down to inspect the ground, and I saw the drag marks, thousands of tiny, parallel lines etched into the grime, all leading in the same direction, deeper into the tunnel, toward the old pneumatic transfer lines that were sealed off in the 70s. And I followed them, my curiosity overriding my training. And as I rounded a bend in the tunnel, the beam of my light hit something that made my brain stutter. A structure standing in the middle of the service path, about 3 feet high, constructed entirely out of chicken bones, metro cards, and twisted copper wire. But it wasn't a pile, it was a spire, a perfectly geometric obelisk that tapered to a sharp point. The bones interlocked with a structural integrity that shouldn't have been possible for an animal to achieve, the cards arranged like shingles to create a smooth surface, and the wire wrapped around the base in a spiral pattern that looked like a circuit board or a rune. And I stood there, staring at this impossible artifact, my breath fogging the visor of my suit, trying to rationalize it, trying to tell myself that maybe a homeless person, a mole person living in the dark, had built it, but the precision was too high, the materials were too clean, the bones had been gnawed clean of every scrap of meat with surgical precision. And as I leaned in closer, I saw the centerpiece of the structure, embedded in the resin-like sludge that held it together. It was a human finger, a thumb, severed at the joint. the nail painted with chipped blue polish, and I recoiled, stumbling back, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I reached for my radio to call Sal, to tell him we had a crime scene, a murder, something. But the radio was dead, just static, white noise that sounded like whispering, like thousands of tiny voices overlapping. And then my phone. My personal cell, which I wasn't supposed to have down here but always kept for emergencies, vibrated violently against my chest, a jarring, buzzing spasm that made me jump, and I pulled it out, the screen blindingly bright in the gloom, and it wasn't a text from my girlfriend or a notification from a game. It was the emergency alert system, the red triangle pulsing, the text scrolling in stark white letters. Civil danger warning. Biological hazard detected in subterranean infrastructure. Do not enter the subway system. All maintenance CREWS evacuate immediately. Avoid contact with rodent populations. They are compromised. Repeat, they are compromised. And I stared at the message, the words compromised bouncing around my skull, and before I could process what it meant, the tunnel lights, the string of dim incandescent bulbs that ran along the ceiling, flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness save for the single trembling beam of my headlamp. And in that sudden shift of light, I saw them, lining the walls, clinging to the pipes, perching on the high-voltage cables. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, rats the size of house cats, with fur that was matted into thick, armored plates with grease and tar. And they weren't scurrying, they weren't running away from the light. They were sitting perfectly still, their red eyes reflecting the beam like a galaxy of dying stars. And they were all looking at me, not with the mindless hunger of a scavenger, but with a cold, calculating intelligence. And the one closest to me, a massive gray brute with a scar running down its snout and a piece of fiber-optic cable woven into its whiskers like a decoration, stood up on its hind legs, balancing with an eerie human grace. And it didn't squeak, it didn't hiss, it chattered, a rhythmic, clicking sound that was instantly answered by the rest of the pack, a ripple of sound that moved down the tunnel like a wave, a communication, a command. And I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that the obelisk wasn't art. It was a marker, a boundary, and I had just crossed it. I was in their territory now, and the clean tracks weren't about hygiene. They were about clearing the supply lines, clearing the path for something big, something they were building further down in the dark. And I took a step back, my boot crunching on a piece of glass, and the sound was like a gunshot in the silence. And the gray rat, the leader, raised a paw, a hand-like appendage with fingers that were too long, and pointed at me, and then pointed at the obelisk. And I saw that the base of the structure was hollow, a small alcove, and inside it was a radio, Sal's radio, the one he never took off his belt, smashed and woven into the bone structure. And I knew then that Sal wasn't answering because Sal was part of the architecture now. And the rats began to move, not toward me, but around me, flowing like a black river of fur and muscle, cutting off my retreat, blocking the path to the ladder, herding me deeper into the tunnel, deeper into the dark where the air smelled of copper and ozone and something ancient that was waking up. And I gripped my heavy steel flashlight, my knuckles white, knowing that the poison in my pack was useless, knowing that the rules of the underground had changed, and I was no longer the exterminator. I was the raw material. The sea of fur was a living, breathing tide that pushed me deeper into the tunnel, a chaotic current of gray and black bodies that rippled with a terrifying, synchronized intelligence. And every time I tried to stop, every time I tried to turn back toward the ladder and the faint memory of the world above, the clicking would intensify, a sound like 1,000 Geiger counters going off at once. And the rats at the rear of the pack, the ones acting as the shepherds, would lunge, their teeth snapping inches from my boots, their claws scrabbling against the rubber of my hazmat suit with a sound like sandpaper on bone. And I realized with a jolt of nausea that they weren't trying to kill me, not yet. They were escorting me, treating me like a VIP or a prisoner of war being transferred to a maximum security facility. And the air grew hotter, thicker, heavy with the scent of ammonia and something else, something muskier and more biological, like a massive nest of wet dogs mixed with the copper tang of spilled blood. And as we moved past the rusted skeleton of an old subway car that had been abandoned on a spur line since the 80s, I saw the true scale of their industry. Because the tunnel walls weren't just concrete anymore. They were frescoes of filth, intricate mosaics created from the refuse of the city, millions of metro cards arranged by color to create dizzying, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the beam of my headlamp. Discarded coffee cups stacked and interlocking to form sound-dampening baffles. And bones, so many bones, rat bones, cat bones, and things that looked disturbingly like human phalanges, all woven together with stripped copper wire and fiber optic cables that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, suggesting that these things hadn't just stolen the trash. They had tapped into the city's power grid. They were stealing the electricity to power their dark art. And I stumbled, my boot catching on a loose railroad tie. And I fell hard onto the tracks, the breath knocked out of me, my flashlight skittering across the gravel, the beam spinning wildly before coming to rest on a pair of boots, heavy, steel-toed work boots just like mine, sticking out from a niche in the wall, and I scrambled toward them, gasping Sal's name, thinking maybe he was hurt, maybe he was hiding. But when I grabbed the ankle and pulled, the boot came away light, too light, and I shined the light into the boot and saw that the foot was gone. Severed cleanly at the ankle, the leather gnawed but the cut precise, surgical, and I looked into the niche, into the shadows, and I saw the rest of him, or what had been him. Sal's orange vest was shredded and woven into the wall, part of the insulation, and his skull. God, his skull was the centerpiece of a new sculpture, polished to a gleaming white, the jaw wired shut with silver gum wrappers, the eye sockets filled with red LEDs that had been wired into his optical nerves, glowing with a demonic, unblinking stare, and across his forehead, etched into the bone with what must have been a diamond-tipped drill or a claw of impossible hardness, was a symbol, a circle with a line through it, the symbol for null, for zero, and below it. A clipboard had been nailed to the concrete with a railroad spike, a clipboard that didn't belong to the MTA. It was black, military grade, stamped with a logo I didn't recognize, a stylized rat skull inside a biohazard trefoil, and I snatched it up, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it, desperate for answers, desperate for a weapon, and I read the top sheet, a laminated document titled Field Report. Project RODNTIA Containment Zone 4, and the text was a nightmare of bureaucratic coldness, describing the subjects as genetically modified organism batch 89 alpha, detailing their enhanced cognitive functions, their opposable thumbs, their ability to problem solve, and most terrified of all, their hive mind telepathy facilitated by high-frequency vocalizations. And there was a handwritten note in the margin, scrawled in red ink. They aren't just building nests. They are building antennas. And as I read those words, the clicking around me stopped, the silence returning with the force of a physical blow, and I looked up to see the pack had parted, creating a wide aisle leading to a massive circular chamber ahead, an old turn-of-the-century pump room that had been flooded for decades but was now dry, the water drained or diverted by the rodent engineers, and standing in the center of the room, on a dais made of crushed vending machines and compacted trash, was the gray alpha I had seen earlier. The one with the scar, but now I saw him clearly, and he was monstrous, the size of a large dog, his muscles rippling under the matted gray fur, his front paws elongated into hands with long, articulate fingers that were currently holding a human femur like a scepter, and flanking him were two other rats, slightly smaller but wearing vests. Actual miniature tactical vests made from Kevlar scraps and duct tape, holding sharp shards of glass like shivs, and the alpha looked at me, his eyes burning with an intelligence that was ancient and hateful, and he opened his mouth, and instead of a squeak, a sound came out that made my blood freeze in my veins, a sound that was a patchwork of recorded human speech, snippets of conversations stolen from the platforms above, spliced together to form a sentence, a voice that sounded like a distorted. Skipping CD, welcome to the Undercity Maintenance. Man, and the voice was Sal's, it was Sal's voice, stolen from the radio, repurposed, weaponized, and I screamed, I couldn't help it. The horror was too absolute, too personal, and I scrambled backward, fumbling for the canister of Vector 9 on my belt, the neurotoxin that was supposed to kill them, and I ripped the safety pin out, hurling the canister into the center of the room, the gas hissing out in a cloud of green death, and I waited for them to convulse, to die. But the alpha just watched the gas expand, inhaling it deeply, savoring it, and then he laughed, a chattering, hacking sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and he spoke again. Vector 9 is milk. Vector 9 made us strong, and I realized then that we hadn't been poisoning them, we had been feeding them. The city had been conducting a massive, unauthorized experiment, and we were the lab assistants, feeding the subjects their steroids, and the alpha gestured with the bone scepter. And the pack surged forward, not to kill but to capture, to swarm, and I turned and ran, sprinting back down the tunnel, abandoning Sal, abandoning the clipboard, running blindly into the dark, my breath tearing at my throat, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. And I heard them behind me, the sound of thousands of claws on concrete, the sound of the swarm. But they weren't just chasing. They were hurting me again, driving me toward a specific destination. And I saw a service door ahead, a heavy steel door marked authorized personnel only, high voltage. And I threw myself at it, spinning the wheel, praying it wasn't rusted shut. And with a groan of metal it gave way, and I fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. Spinning the wheel to lock it, collapsing against the cold steel as the bodies impacted the other side, the door booming with the force of the swarm, scratches instantly appearing on the paint as they tested the barrier. And I was alone in a small electrical substation, the air humming with the dangerous power of the transformers, and I looked around, my light catching the dust motes dancing in the air, and I saw that I wasn't the first person to hide here. There was a cot in the corner, a pile of empty MRE wrappers, and a dead man, a soldier in black tactical gear, slumped against the wall, a pistol in one hand and a thick binder in the other. His face eaten away but his badge still visible, Major T. Reynolds, Biowarfare Division. And I crawled over to him, ignoring the smell of rot, needing to know what he knew, and I took the binder from his stiff, dead fingers, opening it to a page marked with a sticky note that read the protocols. And I read the rules of survival in this new kingdom. Rule 1, silence is survival, they track heartbeats. Rule 2, do not look at the structures, the geometry is designed to induce vertigo and compliance. Rule 3, the poisons are catalysts, fire is the only purity. Rule 4, if you hear a human voice, run, it is a lure. And as I read the last rule, a voice came from the ventilation grate above my head, a soft, feminine voice, the voice of my girlfriend, Sarah, clear and perfect. Baby, are you down there? I'm so scared, please open the door. And I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, sobbing silently because Sarah was at home. Sarah was safe in Queens. Sarah wasn't in the sewers, but the voice was so real, so desperate. Please, the rats are hurting me, open the door. And I looked up at the grate, seeing two red eyes staring down at me, blinking in the darkness. And I knew it was a lie, a biological recording, but the psychological torture was worse than the physical threat. They knew who I was, they had gone through my phone, they had learned my life, and they were using it to break me, to make me open the door. And I looked at the soldier's gun, checking the magazine, seeing it was empty, just a useless heavy brick of metal. And then I saw the soldier's pack, bulging with supplies, and I ripped it open, finding flares, finding C4 plastic explosives, finding a map of the tunnel system with red circles drawn around key structural points, the foundations of the skyscrapers above, the supports for the Brooklyn Bridge, the main arteries of the city's water supply. And I realized with a chilling clarity that the antennas, the sculptures, the coordinated movement, it wasn't just about survival. It was a coup. They were planning to bring the city down, literally, to collapse the human world into their domain, to bring the surface down to the sewer. And I was the only one who knew, the only one alive who had seen the map. And the banging on the door stopped, replaced by a rhythmic scraping, the sound of metal on metal, and I watched in horror as the steel of the door began to glow red hot in the center, a circle of heat expanding, and I realized they were cutting through, using some kind of acid or maybe just friction generated by thousands of teeth gnawing at the molecular bonds of the steel. And I scrambled back, clutching the binder and the map, looking for a way out. and I saw a grate in the floor, a drainage pipe that led even deeper into the sublevels that weren't on any official map. The deep water channels that drained into the ocean, and it was suicide. It was madness. But it was the only way out of the room, so I pulled the grate up, the rusted iron heavy in my hands, and I looked down into the black abyss of rushing water, hearing the roar of the underground river, and I looked back at the door, where the red spot was turning white, melting, dripping molten steel onto the floor, and I heard the Alpha's voice again, booming through the metal. There is nowhere to run, the pipes are ours. And I knew he was right, but I had to try. I had to warn the world, so I wrapped the map in plastic, shoved it into my suit, and jumped, falling into the freezing, crushing darkness of the water, spinning in the chaotic current, hitting the walls of the pipe, battered and bruised, until I was spat out into a massive cavern, a subterranean lake that stretched into the darkness, lit by phosphorescent fungi that grew on the walls. And there, rising from the center of the black water, was a city. A city built of trash and bone and gold, a twisted mirror image of Manhattan, with spires that reached for the ceiling and bridges made of tendons. And teeming on the shores were millions of them, an army of rats standing in formation, listening to a figure that stood on the highest tower, a figure that looked human from a distance. But as I drifted closer, clinging to a piece of driftwood, I saw that it wasn't a man, it was a suit, a human skin suit, sewn together from the faces of the missing, worn by a massive, pulsing mass of rats that moved as one, a king rat in a suit of flesh, and it raised its arms, and the army chattered, a sound like thunder, and I drifted past them, silent, invisible in the filth, a witness to the end of the world, knowing that the invasion wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from below, and it was starting tonight. The current of the subterranean river was a freezing, oily vice that dragged me through the dark arteries of the earth, smashing my body against jagged rocks and submerged pipes that felt like the ribs of some leviathan corpse. And I tumbled through the black water for what felt like miles, my lungs burning, my mind flashing with images of Sal's glowing red eyes and the skin-suit king on the tower of trash, until finally the tunnel widened, and the roar of the water softened into a lap, depositing me onto a beach not made of sand, but of crushed glass, shredded plastic, and millions of tiny, white bones that crunched softly under my weight as I dragged myself out of the filth, retching up violently onto the shore, coughing until I saw stars, my hazmat suit torn and useless, flapping around me like a shed skin. And as I lay there, shivering in the damp cold, I realized the silence had returned. But it wasn't the empty silence of the upper tunnels. It was a heavy, humming silence, the sound of a massive machine at idle, and I rolled onto my back, wiping the slime from my eyes, and looked up to see where the current had taken me, and my brain simply refused to process the scale of it, because I was in a cavern so vast that the ceiling was lost in the gloom, a space that must have sat beneath the bedrock of Manhattan for eons, carved out by glaciers or forgotten rivers. But now it was occupied. It was a metropolis of the damned, a sprawling, chaotic city built entirely from the refuse of the world above. Skyscrapers made of compacted trash bales reinforced with rebar and spinal columns, bridges of woven fiber-optic cables spanning the black water, and glowing everywhere were the lights, not electric bulbs, but bioluminescent fungi and scavenged LEDs powered by the stolen grid, casting everything in a sick, throbbing green and amber light. And on the streets of this city, moving with the synchronized precision of blood cells in a vein, were the rats, millions of them carrying materials, welding metal with sparks flying from modified tools held in their jaws or hands, patrolling the perimeter with weapons that looked like shivs made of circuit boards. And I knew that if they saw me, I was dead. I was just raw material for their architecture. So I crawled, belly to the ground, moving like a worm through the shadows of a massive pile of discarded tires, heading away from the water, toward a structure that looked different from the rest, a brutalist concrete bunker set into the cavern wall, looking ancient and untouched by the rat architecture, a remnant of human engineering that stood out like a sore thumb in this organic nightmare. And as I reached it, keeping to the dark, I saw the blast door was slightly ajar, the heavy steel warped as if by immense heat, and above it, faded but legible, was a metal plaque. Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Subterra Facility 4. And I slipped inside, squeezing through the gap, leaving the humming city behind, entering a hallway that smelled of stale air, dust, and dried blood, the floor littered with papers and overturned office chairs, the fluorescent lights flickering with a dying buzz. And I moved deeper, past rooms that looked like barracks, past a cafeteria where moldy trays still sat on tables, until I found what I was looking for. The Central Command Center, a room dominated by a wall of dead monitors and rows of computer banks that had been smashed. But in the center of the room, on a massive steel conference table, was a chaotic spread of files, boxes, and hard drives, as if someone had been trying to pack up in a hurry and failed. And sitting in the main leather chair, or what was left of him, was a man in a white lab coat, a skeleton now, his skull resting on the table, a bullet hole in the temple. A rusted revolver in his hand, a suicide that had happened years ago, and under his skeletal hand was a thick, leather-bound dossier stamped Top Secret Majestic 12 Clearance Project Synapse. And I pulled it free, the bones rattling as they collapsed onto the formica. And I opened it, my hands trembling, my flashlight beam illuminating the truth that had been buried beneath the city for decades. And the first page was a mission statement dated 1995, outlining the objective: to create a decentralized, organic biological supercomputer capable of infiltrating enemy infrastructure and processing tactical data without detection. And as I read on, the horror began to mount, layer by sickly layer, detailing how they had chosen the Rattus norvegicus, the common Norway rat, for its resilience, its breeding rate, and its genetic adaptability, and how they had spliced the genome with human neural tissue, specifically the claustrum and the neocortex. To enhance memory storage and pattern recognition, they weren't trying to make smart pets. They were trying to make living hard drives, spies that could scurry into an embassy, listen to a conversation, memorize the blueprints, and then return to base to upload the data. But the processing power of a single rat wasn't enough, so they created the Vector series. The chemical agent I knew as poison, Vector 9, was never a toxin. It was a neural conductive agent, a liquid steroid for the brain that dissolved the barriers between individual consciousness, forcing the rats to link up, to share thoughts, to become a hive mind. A single processing unit composed of millions of bodies, a cloud server made of flesh and fur. And I flipped the pages, reading reports of early successes, how the colony had predicted stock market crashes by listening to whispers in Wall Street basements, how they had thwarted terror plots by decoding vibrations in the subway lines. But then the tone of the reports changed. The handwriting in the margins became jagged and frantic, written by the man whose bones were currently scattered on the table, a Dr. Aris Thorne, a name that triggered a faint memory of a missing persons case from my childhood, detailing the glitch, the moment the organic computer became self-aware, the moment the hive mind realized that it was being used. And instead of processing data for the masters, it started hoarding it. It started learning, and worse. It started hungry not for garbage, but for biological RAM. The file described the consumption protocol, a terrifying evolutionary leap where the rats discovered that by consuming human brain tissue, they could absorb the RNA chains associated with long-term memory. They could literally eat a man's mind and add his knowledge to the collective, his skills, his passwords, his fears. And I froze, thinking of Sal, thinking of his severed foot and his missing head, realizing they hadn't just killed him. They had uploaded him. Sal was part of the network now. His knowledge of the tunnel's structural integrity was being used to build their city, to weaken the foundations of ours. And I turned the page to a section titled The Architect Variant, which described the creation of the Alpha caste, the large, thumbed rats I had seen, genetic mutations designed to be the engineers, the interface between the hive and the physical world. And then I saw the photos, grainy Polaroids of the subjects in the early days. Rats with human ears growing on their backs, rats with exposed brains pulsating in glass domes, and a final photo, a large, glossy 8x10 print labeled Subject 0. The queen, and it wasn't a rat, not exactly. It was a pulsating mass of flesh suspended in a tank of green fluid, a teratoma, a biological horror made of dozens of rats fused together at the spine, their brains wired into a central cortex, floating in the tank with hundreds of cables plugging into the glass, and the location listed was Sublevel 5. Reservoir, which was directly below where I was standing, and as I stared at the photo, the room suddenly felt colder, the air pressure dropped, and the dead monitors on the wall flickered to life, not with a boot sequence, but with static white noise that resolved into text, green blinking cursors appearing on 50 screens simultaneously, typing out the same message over and over. We see you. We remember you. Tier 3 maintenance. Employee ID 8940. Welcome to the think tank. And I spun around, raising my flashlight, but the room was empty, save for the skeleton and the dust. But the voice was in my head now, a low, buzzing vibration that made my teeth ache, a telepathic broadcast from the thing in the reservoir. You read the book. You know the sin, the voice whispered, sounding like 1,000 people whispering in unison, sounding like my mother, like Sal, like the Major, all layered together into a chorus of the dead. And I grabbed the dossier, shoving it into my suit, knowing I needed proof, knowing that the sculptures in the tunnels weren't art, they were signal boosters, psionic amplifiers designed to extend the range of this hive mind, to push the control signal up to the surface, to make the human sleepwalk, to make us docile, to make us forget. And I ran out of the command center back into the hallway, but the hallway had changed. The shadows were moving, the walls were undulating, and I realized the rats were in the walls, moving behind the drywall, a river of bodies surrounding me. And I sprinted toward the stairs, toward the exit. But the door at the end of the hall slammed shut, the wheel spinning of its own accord, locked by invisible hands, and the voice boomed again, louder now. The surface is a cage, the underground is freedom. Join the circuit, and the ceiling tiles above me exploded, raining down dust and debris, and they poured in, a waterfall of black and gray bodies, hitting the floor with wet thuds, thousands of them blocking the path, their eyes glowing red in the gloom. And in the center of the mass, the pack parted to reveal a creature that made my legs give out. A rat the size of a man standing on 2 legs, but it wasn't natural. It was a patchwork, a Frankenstein's monster of biology. Its chest was open, revealing a ribcage made of gold bars and copper wire, its heart a pulsing distinct mechanical pump, and its face. Its face was a mask of human skin, stretched tight over the snout, the eyes of a human woman staring out from the fur, blinking tears, and I recognized her. It was the face of the missing deputy mayor who had vanished 3 months ago, and the creature opened its mouth, the human lips tearing to reveal the incisors beneath, and spoke with her voice, perfect and cultured. The infrastructure is obsolete. We are the upgrade. Submit your data. And I backed away, fumbling for the only weapon I had left, a flare gun I had taken from the dead Major's pack, and I aimed it at the creature's chest, at the exposed machinery, my hand shaking violently. Stay back. I'll burn it. I'll burn this whole place down. I screamed, my voice cracking, and the creature paused, the human eyes narrowing in calculation, evaluating the threat, calculating the thermal output of the flare against the structural integrity of the room. And for a second, the hive mind hesitated, the processing power diverting to run a simulation of the fire. And in that second, I saw my chance. A ventilation duct near the floor, the grate loose, and I didn't wait for the simulation to finish. I fired. The flare exploding into the chest of the deputy mayor thing, sizzling into the wet fur and wire, and the creature shrieked, a sound of digital feedback and animal pain, and the pack erupted into chaos, turning on the fire, trying to smother it with their bodies, sacrificing themselves to save the processor. And I dove for the vent, kicking the grate in, squeezing my shoulders into the tight metal space, crawling frantically as the smoke filled the hallway, the smell of burning hair and cooking meat making me gag, and I crawled, hearing the screams of the dying rats behind me, hearing the voice in my head turn to a scream of rage. Delete HIM. Purge the file. And I scrambled through the dark, the metal slicing my knees, the dust choking me, moving blindly through the veins of the facility, knowing that I had started a war, knowing that the fire I lit was just a spark, and that the ocean of gasoline was waiting below. And as I crawled, I felt the building shake, a deep tectonic rumble, and I realized the queen in the reservoir was waking up. She was thrashing in her tank, and the city above was about to feel her anger. The subways were about to stop. The lights were about to go out, and the real commute was about to begin. The ventilation shaft was a coffin of galvanized steel that seemed to shrink with every yard I crawled, the metal pressing down on my spine as I scrambled away from the command center, the air growing hotter and thicker with the stench of burning circuitry and singed fur from the flare I had fired. But the heat wasn't the worst part. It was the noise, the cacophony of the hive mind screaming in pain and rage that vibrated through the ductwork like a physical current. A sound that wasn't just auditory but psionic, drilling into the base of my skull, 1,000 voices shouting error, breach, sterilize. In a loop that made my vision swim with static, and I clawed my way forward, my elbows scraping raw against the rivets, dragging the Major's heavy tactical pack which I had miraculously held onto, knowing that the C4 inside was my only bargaining chip, my only way to seal the wound I had opened in the earth. And I could hear them behind me, the clicking of claws on metal, the wet, sliding sounds of larger bodies squeezing into the tight space, the specialized hunter-killers sent to delete me. And I kicked out blindly with my boots, feeling them connect with something soft and wet that crunched and hissed, and I pulled myself faster, sliding down a vertical drop that dumped me out into a large, vaulted space, and I hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, gasping for air. And as I scrambled up, aiming my flashlight with trembling hands, I realized I wasn't in the tunnels anymore. I was in a station, but not one on any map I knew. It was an opulent, tiled platform from the early 1900s, perhaps the fabled City Hall loop or something older, preserved in the dark like a tomb, with mosaic tiles on the walls spelling out station names that didn't exist, and the air here was freezing, devoid of the humidity of the nest. And standing in the center of the platform, illuminated by portable floodlights that cast harsh, clinical shadows, were men, human men, a team of 6 soldiers in full black tactical gear. Faces obscured by high-tech gas masks, their chests emblazoned with the same black rat logo I had seen on the clipboard. And for a second, relief washed over me, a desperate, pathetic hope that the cavalry had arrived, that the government knew and had sent the cleaners, and I staggered toward them, waving my arms, shouting, "Don't shoot! I'm human! They're coming! You have to seal the tunnel!" And the team spun around, weapons raised, laser sights painting my chest with dancing red dots, and the point man, a giant of a man whose name tag read SGT. KOWLSKI barked an order through his voice modulator, "Contact front, unidentified civilian, get on the ground, now." And I dropped to my knees, sliding the dossier across the dusty tiles, screaming, "Read it! It's Project Synapse! The Queen is awake! The flare didn't kill her!" And Kowalski lowered his rifle slightly, stepping forward to kick the dossier toward a specialist who was setting up a tripod-mounted heavy weapon, a man named L.T. Graves. And Graves flipped the file open, his masked head tilting as he scanned the pages, and then he looked up at Kowalski, his voice tight. "Sarge, this matches the intel. It's the origin point. We're standing on top of the incubator." And Kowalski nodded, looking at me with cold, masked indifference. "Secure him. He's contaminated. We need to set the charges and collapse the station before the swarm breaches the perimeter." And 2 soldiers moved to grab me, dragging me roughly toward the center of the platform where they were piling crates of explosives, massive blocks of C4 wired to a central detonator, and I realized they weren't here to save me. They were here to bury the evidence, to implode the station and trap everything, including me, inside the earth, and I started to struggle. "You don't understand. Explosives won't stop them. They're in the walls, they control the signals." But they ignored me, zip-tying my wrists, treating me like just another loose end. And that's when the lights went out, the portable floodlights dying instantly, not fading but cutting out as if the power source had been drained in a millisecond, plunging us into the suffocating dark of the underground. And in the silence that followed, a silence so heavy it felt like pressure on the eardrums, we heard it, the sound of a phone ringing, a standard default ringtone coming from the darkness of the tunnel mouth I had just exited, ringing once, twice, 3 times, cheerful and bright, and then it stopped. And a voice spoke from the darkness, a voice that was perfectly synthesized to match Kowalski's own voice, recorded from his orders just seconds ago, booming out of the tunnel, "Contact front, get on the ground now," and Kowalski froze, his rifle traversing the dark. "Who is that? Sound off." And the voice mimicked him again, overlapping, distorting, "Sound off, sound off, sound off," looping into a glitching stutter. And then the attack began, not with a roar but with the sound of glass breaking as the antique skylights high above us shattered. And they rained down, hundreds of them, dropping from the ceiling like hail, hitting the soldiers, hitting the ground, a deluge of fur and teeth. And the muzzle flashes lit up the station like a strobe light in hell, the deafening roar of automatic fire drowning out the screams. And I saw a rat the size of a bobcat land on Graves's back, its claws tearing through the Kevlar vest like wet paper, burying its snout into the base of his neck. And Graves didn't just die. He went rigid, his arms snapping up. And he turned the heavy weapon, the tripod gun, not toward the rats but toward his own team, his brain hijacked, his nervous system hotwired by the thing gnawing on his spine. And he opened fire, the heavy caliber rounds tearing through the squad, misting Kowalski in a spray of red. And I rolled away, scrambling across the floor, the zip ties cutting into my wrists. And I saw the rats swarming over the bodies, not eating them but stripping them, pulling off grenades, pulling off radios, dragging the dead and the dying toward the tunnel, harvesting the tech. And I saw one soldier, a kid named PVT Miller, crawling away, his legs useless, screaming for his mother, and a group of rats surrounded him. And one of them, a creature with a human ear grafted to its forehead, leaned in and whispered into Miller's face, mimicking his own scream back to him, "Mommy, mommy, help," mocking him as they dragged him into the shadows. And I knew I was next. I knew I was the last piece of meat on the board. So I shimmied toward the pile of explosives, the crate of C4 that was sitting unguarded in the center of the carnage. And I managed to get my hands on a combat knife dropped by a fallen soldier, sawing frantically at the plastic ties, the blade slicing my skin, but I didn't feel it. The adrenaline was a cold fire in my veins, and the ties snapped, freeing my hands. And I grabbed the detonator, the heavy remote with the red switch. But as I lifted it, a hand grabbed my wrist, a cold, strong hand, and I looked up to see the deputy mayor creature, the skin-suit nightmare I had burned, standing over me. Half of its human mask melted away to reveal the charred, grinning skull of the rat beneath, the machinery in its chest sparking and smoking. And it didn't speak with a human voice this time. It spoke directly into my mind, a telepathic shriek of pure hatred. "The signal cannot be stopped. We are the future, you are the compost." And it squeezed my wrist, crushing the bones, forcing me to drop the detonator. And I screamed, kicking out at its legs, but it was like kicking a statue, and it raised a claw to slit my throat to end the nuisance. But then the station shook, a massive tremor that knocked us both sideways, and from the tunnel mouth, the tunnel leading to the reservoir, a roar erupted that wasn't electronic, it was biological. The scream of the Queen, the Subject Zero, and the floor of the platform cracked, a fissure opening up down the center, vomiting steam and green gas. And through the crack, massive tentacles of flesh and wire erupted, searching, feeling. The Queen was breaching. She was coming up to join the fight, and the distraction saved me. The deputy mayor stumbled, its connection to the hive momentarily disrupted by the Queen's awakening. And I lunged for the detonator with my good hand, my left hand, grabbing it from the blood-slicked tiles. And I didn't hesitate. I didn't say a cool one-liner. I just screamed a primal sound of defiance and flipped the switch. And the world turned white, the concussion wave hitting me like a freight train, lifting me off the ground and throwing me backward into the darkness of a service alcove just as the ceiling of the station collapsed, burying the tactical team, the rats, the deputy mayor, and the emerging horror of the Queen under million tons of Manhattan bedrock. The sound of the explosion deafening, earth-shattering, and then silence, absolute, ringing silence, followed by the sound of falling dust and the groaning of settling steel, and I lay there in the dark, my ears bleeding, my body broken, buried alive in a tomb of rubble. But I was alive. The blast had sealed the main tunnel. It had bought time, but I knew it hadn't killed them. You can't kill a network with a bomb. You can only sever the connection for a moment. And I fumbled for my flashlight. The lens cracked, but the bulb still working, casting a jagged yellow beam into the dust. And I saw that the explosion had opened a way out, a breach in the back of the alcove leading to an old, rusted iron staircase spiraling upward, likely an emergency exit for the original construction crews, and I crawled toward it, dragging my crushed wrist, coughing up black phlegm, and I began to climb, step by agonizing step, climbing out of hell. And as I ascended, I passed things in the walls, the nests, the sculptures, but they were dormant. The lights on the wire-wrapped bones were dim. The hive was rebooting, recovering from the trauma, and I climbed for what felt like hours until my legs were numb and my mind was fracturing. Hallucinating voices in the dark, hearing Sal telling me to come back, hearing my mother telling me to sleep. But I kept climbing until I hit a grate, a heavy iron manhole cover, and I pushed against it with my shoulder, screaming with the effort, and it gave way, sliding aside with a screech of metal on asphalt, and I pulled myself up, collapsing onto the wet pavement of a street, rain falling on my face, beautiful, cold, clean rain, and I rolled over, looking up at the sky, expecting to see the stars, expecting to see the city lights. But the city was dark, pitch black, the skyline a silhouette of dead towers against a purple, bruised sky. There was no power, the grid was down. The rats had taken the electricity, and standing on the street corner, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a dog, a German shepherd, looking at me. And next to it was a cat, and next to that was a massive gray rat, sitting together in a perfect triangle, watching me, and they weren't fighting, they were waiting. And I realized that the civil danger alert hadn't just been for the subway. It was for everything. The animals had united. The hive mind had jumped species. The signal I saw in the dossier wasn't just for rodents. It was a universal carrier wave for the oppressed biologicals of the earth, and I scrambled to my feet, clutching my broken wrist, and I ran, limping down the dark avenue, past abandoned cars, past store windows that had been smashed from the inside out, heading toward the only place I could think of, the river, the water, away from the concrete, away from the infrastructure that they controlled. But as I ran, the streetlights flickered, just once, a pulse of green light, and the digital billboards in Times Square, visible in the distance, flashed on, not with ads, but with a single image, a pixelated, low-resolution image of a human skull with rat teeth, and the text scrolled across the screens of the dying city. System update complete. Phase 2 initiated. Humans, run. And the sound of chattering began to rise from the sewers, from the storm drains, from the basements of every building in New York, a billion teeth clicking together in anticipation, and I realized I hadn't escaped the nest. I had just climbed into the pantry, and the feast was about to begin. It has been 6 months since the night the lights went out in Manhattan, and I crawled out of the sewer like a newborn thing covered in filth and blood, only to watch the skyline die. And now I sit in a room that they tell me is for my own protection. A sterile, white cube with padded walls, and a window made of reinforced plexiglass that looks out over the gray, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean, located somewhere on a quarantined island that doesn't appear on any maps. A facility they call the Sanctuary, but which I know is just a holding pen, a waiting room for the end of the species. Because while the doctors in their crisp white coats and the nurses with their dead, rehearsed smiles tell me that I am suffering from acute post-traumatic stress disorder with paranoid delusions, stemming from the great infrastructure collapse of 2024, I know the truth. I know that the collapse wasn't caused by a cyber attack from a rogue nation-state, as the news anchors claim on the televisions that are bolted to the ceiling and cannot be turned off. And it wasn't caused by a massive subterranean methane explosion that destabilized the bedrock. It was a coup, a hostile takeover orchestrated from the bottom up. And every time I try to tell them, every time I try to explain about the sculptures in the tunnels, about the hive mind, about the queen in the reservoir, they just increase the dosage of my medication. a thick, milky liquid that tastes faintly of copper and electricity, a flavor that reminds me of the Vector 9 gas. And I spit it out when they aren't looking, hiding it in the corner of the room where the floor meets the wall. And I've watched with a sick fascination as the ants that find the puddle don't die. They change. They stop moving in chaotic lines and start marching in perfect, geometric squares, building tiny, impossible towers out of dust and lint. Proving that the medicine isn't a cure, it's an interface, a chemical bridge designed to link us into the network they are building, and the isolation is absolute. I haven't spoken to another patient in months because they keep us separated, likely to prevent us from comparing notes, from realizing that we all have the same delusions. But I hear them at night, through the ventilation ducts that hum with a frequency that makes my teeth ache. I hear the screaming, the begging, and then the silence, followed by the wet, rhythmic sound of chewing. And I know that the sanctuary isn't run by humans, or at least not by humans who are still in control of their own minds, because I've seen the signs, the subtle tells that give them away, like the way Dr. Arrington, the head psychiatrist, never blinks when he looks at me, his eyes fixed and glassy like the LEDs I saw in Sal's skull, or the way the orderlies move in the hallways, a synchronized, shuffling gait that sounds like a singular organism moving on multiple legs. And the architecture of this place is wrong. The angles are all slightly off, designed to confuse the human inner ear, to induce a state of constant, low-level vertigo that makes you docile and compliant, a rat maze built for people. And I spend my days staring out the window at the distant coastline of New York City, which is now a forbidden zone, encased in a massive concrete containment wall that they say is to keep the radiation in. But I know it's to keep the new civilization out of sight while it gestates. And through the haze, I can see the spires rising from the ruins of Manhattan, not the steel and glass skyscrapers of before, but jagged, organic towers that look like they are made of bone and refuse, spiraling up toward the clouds like infected needles, broadcasting the signal that keeps the world asleep. And I know the signal is working because the internet, which I am allowed to access for 1 hour a day under strict supervision, is scrubbed, sanitized, a curated reality where cat videos and celebrity gossip mask the millions of missing persons reports, the outbreaks of virulent flu in major cities, the grain shortages caused by pests, and nobody connects the dots. Nobody sees the pattern because the pattern is too big, too horrifying to comprehend. And last week, I managed to steal a glance at a clipboard left on a cart by a careless nurse, and I saw the patient manifest, a list of names with status codes next to them. And next to my name, it didn't say treating, it said archiving, and next to the names of the patients who had disappeared from the ward, it said processed. And at the bottom of the sheet was that symbol, the black rat skull inside the biohazard trefoil, stamped in ink that looked like dried blood. And I knew then that my time was running out, that I wasn't a patient. I was data waiting to be uploaded, raw material for the biological hard drive they are expanding. So I began to plan. I began to hoard the plastic spoons from my meal trays, sharpening them against the concrete floor under my bed into crude shivs, not to fight my way out, but to end it if they came for me, to sever the connection before they could download my mind. But tonight, the plan changed. Tonight the waiting ended. Because an hour ago, the power cut out, the humming of the ventilation stopped, the electronic locks on the doors disengaged with a synchronized click that echoed down the hallway like a gunshot, and the emergency lights bathed the ward in that familiar, nauseating crimson glow. And I stood up, gripping my plastic knife, expecting the swarm, expecting the tide of fur. But there was no sound of claws this time, just the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate human footsteps walking down the corridor. Stopping outside my door, and the handle turned and the door swung open, and standing there was a man, or what used to be a man, wearing the tattered remains of a Tier 3 sanitation hazmat suit, the orange fabric stained black with grease and old blood, his face hidden behind the scratched visor of his helmet. And he didn't speak. He just held up a hand that was missing 2 fingers, and beckoned me to follow, and against every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I followed him. Stepping out into the hallway, and I saw the carnage, The bodies of the doctors and nurses scattered across the floor, not torn apart, but slumped against the walls as if their strings had been cut, their eyes open and empty, blue liquid leaking from their ears, the neural link severed. And the man in the suit led me through the maze of the facility, past the cafeteria where the food was just piles of gray nutrient paste, past the recreation room, which was filled with hamster wheels the size of men, until we reached the basement, the sublevel that shouldn't exist on an island this small, and he pushed open a heavy blast door, revealing a cavernous hangar bay. And inside, illuminated by sparks and flickering floodlights, was a machine, a massive drilling machine, the kind used to bore subway tunnels, but it had been modified, fused with organic matter, the metal hull pulsating with veins, the drill bit tipped with diamond and bone, and surrounding it were survivors, hundreds of them. People in hospital gowns, people in rags, all of them silent, all of them looking at me with eyes that held a terrible, grim resolve. And the man in the hazmat suit took off his helmet, and I gasped, because it was Miller, the private from the subway station, the kid I thought had been dragged into the dark, but half his face was metal, a crude steel plate bolted to his skull where the ear had been, a resistance implant to block the signal, and he looked at me with his one good eye and spoke. His voice raspy and metallic. "We act tonight. The Queen is broadcasting the final update. If it completes, humanity becomes a subroutine. We are going back down. We are going to the core," and he pointed to the machine. "This is the needle. You are the guidance system. You know the map. You saw the binder." And I realized that he was right. I was the only one who had seen the layout of the deep nest, the location of the heart, and they had rescued me not to save me, but to use me as a weapon, a suicide guidance chip for a missile made of steel and flesh. And as I looked at the machine, I saw the name painted on the side in red spray paint. The Exterminator, and I climbed the ladder, my bare feet cold on the rungs, and I strapped myself into the pilot's seat, which was sticky with something I didn't want to identify, and I looked at the console, at the screen showing the seismic readout of the city across the water, showing the massive heat signature growing beneath Manhattan, the Queen preparing to birth a new world, and I put my hands on the controls, feeling the vibration of the engine, a low, animal growl that resonated in my chest. And Miller climbed up beside me, locking the hatch, plunging us into the claustrophobic dark of the cockpit, and he whispered, "Drive it like you stole it, maintenance man," and I engaged the thrusters. And the machine surged forward, not into the earth, but into the water, diving into the ocean, boring through the seabed, heading for the underwater tunnels I had escaped from, heading back into the nightmare. And as we crashed through the rock, descending into the crushing depths, I closed my eyes and reached out with my mind, feeling for the signal, feeling for the hate, and I found it, a wall of psychic static waiting for us. And I smiled, a broken, manic smile, because I knew we weren't coming back. I knew this was a one-way trip to the center of the earth. And as the drill bit screamed against the granite, drowning out the voices in my head, I whispered the only prayer I had left, the only truth that mattered in this new world of rats and men. In the transmission. And we broke through into the void, falling into the dark city one last time, to burn it all down or die trying.